welcome back to the World in a Historic House seminar, following the last two seminars, which have ventured to the US and the Caribbean respectively. In this seminar, we're going to be exploring histories of slavery and empire and how they've been interpreted and examined in Britain's historic houses. We've got a roster of interesting speakers lined up for you today, and there will definitely be time and space for discussion at the end. Corinne Fowler, who is Professor of Postcolonial Literature at the University of Leicester, was due to speak. However, due to the threat of 145 compulsory redundancies at the University of Leicester, the union are asking members to boycott Leicester events. So in order that members did not have to boycott this event, Corinne won't be formally speaking, but I think she is here today. And I wanted to start out by really kind of noting the importance of her work in this area, particularly through the Colonial Countryside project, and just to state our continued support for our colleagues at Leicester. So we have 5 speakers today. I'm going to introduce each of them before they speak. And then at the end, there's going to be lots of time for discussion. So please do, as I said, log your questions and comments as we go along. The session today is going to be kicked off by Charlotte Johnson and Annabelle Gilmore, who will be providing us with a potted history of some of the main moments in the interpretation of Britain's historic houses over the last 15 years or so, and then we'll go on to hear from Margot Finn, Kate Donington, and Andrew Hann. So Charlotte Johnson then completed her MA at the Courtauld and has worked as a curator of the Gilbert collection at the Victoria and Albert Museum. She's now a PhD student at the University of Birmingham and is completing an M4C funded collaborative doctoral award with the National Trust. The project is focused on Kedleston Hall in Derbyshire and is examining the Eastern Museum, which was established by George Curzon to hold objects from his travels and his time as Viceroy of India at the start of the 20th century. Annabelle Gilmore completed her MA at the University of Sheffield and is now a PhD student at the University of Birmingham. Annabelle's completing an M4C funded collaborative doctoral award project with the National Trust, and the project is focused on Charlcote Park in Warwickshire. The house holds a collection of Asian luxury objects originally bought through funds derived from the Jamaican plantations of William Beckford and then sold to the Lucy family at Charlcote. Using the collection as its focus, the project seeks to show how the interconnected histories of Britain's Asian imperial projects and its involvement in slavery shaped country houses and British culture. So over to you, Charlotte and Annabelle.
Thank you, Kate. Annabelle's just going to share her screen. Okay, great. Hello, everyone. We're so pleased to be here for this seminar. Thank you so much to Kate for inviting us. This seminar will explore some of the ways in which British heritage sites and organisations have dealt with complex histories that have often been left off the visitor route. We know this seminar series has a global audience, and so Kate asked us to provide a brief introduction to those of you who may be less familiar with the ins and outs, not only of the key institutions of British heritage industry, but also the political climate of the moment in which these institutions currently operate.
In 1974, the V&A held an exhibition entitled The Destruction of the Country House. Curators saw a plight amongst these grand buildings, which for them, quote, whether palaces or manors, epitomised English history, end quote. This statement reflects how country houses have been primarily regarded in some circles as national heritage to be protected, rather than as sites of power, as Marc Giroir famously described them. Despite publications like the East India Company at Home, these sites are often read as national, not global, echoing David Lowenthal's concept that Britain, quote, the past we prize is domestic, that of others is alien, that is strange and incompatible with ours, end quote.
We got an issue with the slides, Annabelle.
There we go.
There we go. In 2020, the global Black Lives Matter protests and the toppling of a statue of Edward Colston, a trader of enslaved people, brought into sharp relief challenges to this narrow vision of British heritage. This has led to the current culture wars, a term invented by right-wing commentators and politicians who claim that British history is under siege from the woke agenda or a nihilist left faction amongst heritage workers who seek to destructively decolonise and supplant British national history. This culture war has had serious consequences for heritage bodies and those who work within them. The National Trust has been submitted to the Charity Commission for review, and individuals working on so-called woke projects have been subjected to severe trolling and even death threats. Here, a selection of headlines from 2020 and 2021 give a sense of the tone of the conversation.
Simultaneously, the government has suggested it might designate history a low-value subject and change funding and student allocation on that basis. This and wider financial pressures have led to recent closures in a number of history departments, creating a very real threat to the discipline where it is most accessible. We are now going to run through a quick introduction to the National Trust and English Heritage, two key players in the British heritage landscape, who we will hear more about today. We will finish with some further reflection on the political implications of their work on these subjects.
The National Trust is a membership-based charity founded in the late 19th century with the intention of providing green spaces for all and safeguarding built heritage. The Trust now has a membership of nearly 6 million and is responsible for over 780 miles of coastline, more than 250,000 hectares of land, over 500 historic houses, castles, parks and gardens, and nearly 1 million works of art. The Trust considers the properties under their care as saved forever for the nation, thanks to the work of volunteers and experts conserving them and making them accessible to the public. Its edict is forever for everyone. In recent years, the Trust has considered what everyone means, and as a result has sought to explore more diverse histories within their properties.
From 2017 to 2019, the Trust ran a Challenging Histories pilot programme. In 2018, Women in Power explored the centenary of women getting the vote. In 2017, 50 years after the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, Prejudice and Pride explored LGBTQ+ histories at some of the Trust sites. In 2019, People's Landscapes commemorated the 200th anniversary of the Peterloo Massacre. This spirit of exploring complex histories continued into 2020, when the Trust published work that brought to light the connections of 93 of its properties to imperial histories and slavery. This report is available to download on the National Trust website. The Colonial Countryside Project, funded by the Arts Council, started in 2018 and led by Professor Corinne Fowler, also brought the colonial connections to the Trust's properties to the fore. The project worked with primary school children to produce creative responses to 11 of the Trust's properties.
English Heritage started life in 1882 as part of the Office of Works, a governmental department. A Government Act in 1913 saw the office given new powers to collect the most significant historic sites of the land. A new body, English Heritage, was set up in 1983 to take over management of these sites and to run the national system of heritage preservation through things like listed building status and planning. In 2015, English Heritage was split into two charities, Historic England, which manages planning and listed buildings, and English Heritage, responsible for over 400 historic buildings, monuments and sites. English Heritage now has over 1 million members, caring for sites, quote, for the benefit of future generations, end quote.
The noughties saw groundbreaking work in anticipation of the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade in 2007. English Heritage commissioned scoping research in 2006 and follow-up research in 2008. The conference followed, jointly organised with Madge Dresser of the University of West England, and the proceedings were published as Slavery and the British Country House in 2013. This book is available to download from the English Heritage website. English Heritage has further explored Black history in two key projects. In 2010, with Kenwood Connections, a temporary exhibition at Kenwood House, exploring the life of Dido Bell, and in 2017, with new interpretation at Porchester Castle in Hampshire, focusing on the Black prisoners of war held there during the Napoleonic Wars.
The work described above follows the remit of these organisations to conserve and interpret their properties for everyone. So why has this cued such a vitriolic reaction from some quarters? In a long-read article published on Tuesday, Guardian journalist and professor of sociology Gary Young stated, quote, "This statue obsession mistakes adulation for history, history for heritage, and heritage for memory. It attempts to detach the past from the present from morality, and morality from responsibility. In short, it attempts to set our understanding of what has happened in stone, beyond interpretation, investigation, or critique."
Young's characterization explains how, although the government policy is to retain and explain, those on the right wing of the culture wars reject explanation that contradict their version of Britain and its history as they experience it. This dissonance was very clearly articulated by Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary, at the History Matters conference held by right-wing think tank Policy Exchange earlier this year, which is still online if you'd like to watch it. Dowden warns heritage bodies not to airbrush history by focusing on aspects that do not align with his preferred national narrative. This slide shows Dowden meeting with representatives from museums and heritage institutions, explaining his policy and, in many people's view, contravening the arm's length principle intended to protect cultural organisations from governmental interference.
Restore Trust describe themselves as a forum where members, supporters, and friends of the National Trust can discuss their concerns about the future of the charity. They believe that the National Trust has strayed from its purposes and should not investigate negative aspects or so-called negative aspects of British history. Instead, they lobby for a traditional focus on art, architecture, and the family of the house. Their website speaks of their aims to ensure that the National Trust will, quote, "use history as a tool for understanding, not as a weapon," end quote, and, quote, "make all visitors feel welcome without demonizing anybody's history or heritage," end quote. We see here the impact of Elizabeth Edwards and Matt Mead's notion of, quote, "the intuitive chain of equivalence between heritage and the celebratory," end quote, as one of the barriers to the telling of colonial histories in museums.
The past prize by Dowden and Restore Trust is domestic and overwhelmingly white. Recent work by scholars and journalists such as Gahinde Andrews, Corinne Fowler, and Satnam Sangara demonstrate the lasting impact of empire in Britain's national psyche, its key institutions, and the lives of its subjects. They have shown that despite the omission of empire from national narratives, the legacies of empire are embedded and still shape our society. They reveal that the notion of a domestic past free from any connection to empire is an illusion. Despite the noise of the culture wars, many institutions are restating their commitment to researching colonial and imperial histories. For example, there's been a significant increase in doctoral projects funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council that are focused on imperial, global, or Black histories. Our projects are an example of this.
My project, for example, will explore Kedleston Hall's connections to empire. It will do this by examining former Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon's Eastern collection, currently on display in a dedicated museum on the hall's ground floor, and following the itineraries of the objects within it. It will ask what people, processes, and systems impacted the objects throughout their lives, and how country houses worked as spaces of categorization used to construct difference within empire. It will explore how colonial power was exerted through collecting, ordering, and display, and will show the enduring legacies of empire that continue to shape how objects and collections are presented and encountered.
My project, Slavery and Empire on Display at Charlecote Park in Warwickshire, is a project investigating how the Lucy family at Charlecote Park became complicit in slavery and imperialism when they purchased the art objects from the Fonthill Abbey sale in 1823. William Thomas Beckford used his vast wealth derived from enslaved labour on his Jamaican plantations to purchase a variety of Asian artefacts, including ceramics, Japanese lacquerware boxes, and ebony furniture now on display at Charlecote. This work looks to answer to what extent was the Lucy family implicated in the exploitative acts of imperialism and slavery? How does the collection at Charlecote exemplify British cultural desires? And in what way did the system of slavery and imperialism enable this? However, it remains to be seen how, in the context of COVID and funding restrictions, our projects will be incorporated into visitor routes and wider interpretation.
We hope this brief introduction has orientated you in the somewhat bewildering British landscape. We haven't mentioned Brexit, the broader conversation in terms of museums, our generational divides over key political issues, and the history of race relations in the UK, not to mention the conflation of British with English, all of which are highly relevant to this topic. But we hope we've said enough to set the scene for the papers to come and provided you with some context. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, you absolutely have. Thanks very much, Annabelle and Charlotte, for starting us off with with that talk. We're now going to go on to hear from Margot Finn, Kate Donington and Andrew Hann, and they're going to really provide us with their thoughts and reflections on some of these issues. So first then, we have Margot Finn, who is Professor of Modern British History at University College London and has recently completed her term as President of the Royal Historical Society and Trustee of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Margot has previously worked on Victorian popular politics and histories of debt and credit. She now primarily researches and teaches topics relating to British colonial and imperial history. In 2018, she published the co-edited volume, The East India Company at Home, and is currently completing her next book project, Imperial Family Formations, Domestic Strategies and Colonial Power in British India, 1757 to 1857. Great, Margot, do you want to share your screen?
Thank you. I'm hoping I'm doing that. And my only problem is it's now covering my show your slideshow bit. I hate Zoom. All right, can you handle it if I don't take it out of this format?
Yeah,
Great.
of course.
So thanks very much for inviting me. This is it's been simply a terrific series, I think, really productive, and in the midst of Black Lives Matter's really a very productive intervention, I think, in a long-standing discussion of national identity and material culture and heritage. What I want to talk about briefly for about 10 minutes, I want to use a particular British family, English family, the Colbrooks, and explore the relationship between their country houses, their wealth, Caribbean slavery, empire in India, and perhaps an expanded trans-imperial notion of the country house that can take us from the Caribbean through Britain to South Asia. And I was very pleased to listen to Annabelle's description of her dissertation project, which again is one of the ones which in terms of material culture is trying to tie together the Atlantic world and the Indian Ocean world from this perspective. So my thinking here is very much inspired by two reports, both of which were mentioned in the previous presentation. One is the National Trust interim report on the connections between colonialism and properties now in the care of the National Trust, fully downloadable online. And the other is Historic England's report on the impact of transatlantic slavery on England's built environment, a research audit, a report I really commend to anyone who teaches histories of slavery or histories of colonialism. It seems to me that one of the things that's emerged in the vitriolic response to the first of these two reports, the National Trust report, one of the things that's emerged in public debate is the simultaneous conflation of slavery and imperialism, and very often the refusal to think about the ways in which those two phenomena are interlinked that can be distinctive. And I think that putting together the Caribbean world and the Indian Ocean world is one of the ways of teasing out how are slavery and broader imperialisms connected and at what points, and how do those points of connection impact upon material culture, heritage sites, and ultimately our understanding of British history. My own thinking on these issues was very much influenced by a postdoctoral research fellow that we had on the East India Company at Home project, Chris Jefferson, who was employed specifically to look at East India Company families in the 18th and early 19th century, who were also Caribbean slaveholding families. And in the chapter in Katie Donington's book, that I've referenced here, Chris began the, I think, very important work of looking at the ways in which empire families, broadly speaking, diversified their personnel, both in the Caribbean and in India, and thereby diversified and enhanced their wealth potential. And thinking about that wealth, which then underpins the development of country houses, the furnishing of country houses, and the political power, the parliamentary power that comes to rest in them, is, I think, a really important nexus for understanding both the articulation between slavery and empire elsewhere, empire outside of the Caribbean, but also of thinking about the ways in which slavery and empire were interconnected in the past. So I would recommend his piece in the Donington et al. Book. And also, of course, I would recommend the East India Company at Home book, which is free to download and does address the issues of slavery, though not as centrally as we might think. So the Colebrook family that I want to focus on in the next few minutes were a city banking family from the early 18th century, founded by James Colebrook, who was a city banker early in the 18th century from about 1710 onward, and who was also a shareholder in the South Sea Company. Now, by being a shareholder in the South Sea Company, James Colebrook immediately acquired a slave interest, because from 1713, the South Sea Company held the asiento, so it held the right to traffic in human beings in the transatlantic slave trade. Significantly, within a few years of obtaining South Sea Company stock, James also began to invest heavily in East India Company stock. And this twinning of investment in both Caribbean, either slave trade or plantation slavery, and East India Company holdings is not at all uncommon in the 18th century. It's a way of both diversifying a financial portfolio and also of spreading a family out across the piece. Very closely coupled with these investments in the slave trade on the one hand and in the East India Company on the other was James Colebrook's acquisition of country houses in order to substantiate and to materialize his increasing wealth. And we can see this in his purchase of Arnold's in an area that's now North London, Arnold's Grove, and Chilham Castle in Kent. And he begins to set his sons up in country houses as part of a larger effort to translate the wealth derived from the city, derived from the Caribbean, and derived from South Asia into parliamentary power and other forms of British power in this manner. Gatton Park, Surrey, was a country house that I came upon first in the Historic England, a wonderful report that I referred to earlier on, where its ties to Caribbean slavery through Antigua are picked up, but its East India Company ties are not. And again, I think that that's something that as we explore the Caribbean histories of country houses, we want to be thinking about the points in which they also intersect with other versions of British imperialism and ask ourselves why that tended to happen. So Gatton Park was purchased by James, the banker's son, Sir James, for £23,000 in 1751, and its ownership conferred a seat in Parliament, and he sat for that Rottenborough seat for many years. Upon his death, it passed to another brother, Sir George, and crucially, this member was married to an Antiguan heiress, and fantastically wealthy woman, only daughter of a plantation holder, said to have inherited £200,000, so an enormous inheritance, all based on the enslaved on Antiguan estates. What we begin to see here in the two Lady Colbrooks is the merging of city wealth and Caribbean wealth and the ways in which that also bankrolls empire in South Asia. One of the points I would like to make here is that in order to follow the money, we've got to follow the women. One of the things that's often led us to see fewer connections between, for example, Caribbean and South Asian forms of imperialism and their impact upon historical environments is if we focus only on the men, we miss the wealth and we miss aspects of slavery, aspects of empire. And we can see that very much in the Colbrooks with Mary Colebrook, née Gaynor in particular. Her Antiguan plantations come to be enmeshed in the East India Company wealth of her husband, and it's really a joint enterprise between two oceanic worlds that bankrolls quite fantastic wealth in this family in the 1770s. Speculation on the South Sea market, speculation on the East India Company market, and speculation in the purchase of human beings in the Caribbean are all very much entwined in the Colebrook story. And it's that entwined wealth that allows them to transform Gatton Park through the landscaping of Lancelot Capability Brown. Now, this is viewed as an iconic English environment. And to go back to the point that Annabelle and Charlotte were making in their excellent presentation, this notion of an iconic English pastoral environment, behind which, however, sits Antiguan property, enslaved laborers of African descent, and South Asian extraction through empire. So we have the image on the one hand, we've got the wealth behind it that's allowing that image to be constructed. And that's very much the story of the Colebrook's at Gatton. Sir George Colebrook goes fantastically bankrupt in 1774. That's another story, I won't go there. But this bankruptcy with his banking business in the city propels his sons out into the empire and out into the East India Company, where his son, James Edward, is eventually very, very successful and serves as the diplomatic agent or resident in the court of the King of Delhi, or the court of the Emperor of the Mughal Empire, together with his wife, Lady Colebrook, who is notoriously corrupt and I think rather fun. The point I want to make here is that the country house cultures of the British, which are in many ways subsidized by imperial ventures, also come in South Asia in particular to have a significant impact upon the Indian elites. So upon the Mughal elites and the successor states that are breaking away from them. The Delhi court is fantastically rich in material culture, and in the East India Company at Home project, we tried to tell the story of the traffic of many of those goods as luxury goods, as signs of power, back into English, Scottish, and Welsh country houses. What I think we missed in that book, and what I'm beginning to explore now, are the ways in which Indian elites themselves were influenced by all of these rich East India Company servants who were very caught up in material cultures of display, not only in their English country houses, but in their homes in India. And what we begin to see in the circle of the Colebrooks in the 1820s are a number of Indian princes and nawabs who engage in a very active traffic or exchange, purchasing, gifting of English material culture that's suited for English country houses. And several of these princes, including the two that I've depicted here, have one or more English country houses fully furnished with European kit, effectively, in North India. And so that you begin to get a transatlantic, global, if you will, country house aesthetic that extends from Britain into British colonial areas. And I think that trade and its implication, why Indian elites are choosing to do that, merits significantly more investigation. Now, the Colebrooks are ejected rather unhappily from life in Delhi. They are both phenomenally corrupt, and Colebrook is effectively sacked. When he comes back to Britain, the Gatton estate has been lost through the bankruptcy of his father, but the combination of his and his wife's Antiguan wealth and the money that he saved from the East India Company allows them to purchase a new country house, this time in Kent, and the slave compensation money that the couple earn in the 1830s, again, allows a cycle of renewal of the country house life. Seated in Kent, you wouldn't be able to tell by looking at the house that they build that it's built upon imperial foundations, that it's built not only on imperial foundations, but on the intersection between the Atlantic world and the South Asian imperial world. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Margot, for that talk. That's great, and takes us into new ground again. So now we're going to go to Kate Donington, who's Senior Lecturer in History at London South Bank University. Kate's research focuses on the cultural, commercial, political, and familial world the slave owners that slave owners made in both Jamaica and Britain. She's recently published her brilliant book, The Bonds of Family, Slavery, Commerce and Culture in the British Atlantic World. She's also recently co-curated Slavery, Culture and Collecting at the Museum of Docklands, and is a senior historical advisor on the Colonial Countryside Project, which is led by Corinne Fowler that we've mentioned previously. Kate, do you want to go?
Yep, I'm going to share my screen, the classic, as you attempt to navigate the technology. Okay, you can let me know if you can see my slides.
Yep, that's great.
Brilliant. Okay, then so I'm actually not for once going to talk about the Hibbert family directly. There'll be a bit of Hibbert material in there, which is my book, but I'm not going to just go on about them entirely. Okay, so play from the start. Okay, so this paper has been written within the context which some, although not all of you, will be familiar with, which is the vitriolic contestations over the interpretation of histories of slavery and empire within properties in the care of the National Trust. The publication of the Trust's interim report in September 2020 on its properties' connections to these histories was preceded by the re-emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement in June of the same year. Although the report was commissioned long in advance of these events, the two became interlinked by a section of the press keen to draw parallels between the street protests, the most famous of which culminated in the removal of the statue of the slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol, and moves by heritage bodies to investigate their colonial histories. The coalescing of these two distinct but interlinked moments has led to a lucrative field of journalism dedicated to stoking a sense of cultural conflict between those they frame as the guardians of tradition and iconoclastic activists on a mission to destroy the nation's colonial heritage. But just how new is this preoccupation with the relationship between Englishness, domesticity, and the colonial presence? If we depart from the ordered serenity of the metropole's country piles and turn instead to the homes forged out in empire, it's possible to trace a deep-seated and unreconciled anxiety surrounding the presence of colonized people within the sacred space of the Englishman's home. The close proximity of enslaved domestics and the deleterious effects of prolonged colonial contact was written about by the Jamaican historian Edward Long. His history of Jamaica contained passages which lamented the creolizing effects of regular intimate intermingling with enslaved people within the home. He wrote in disgust of the polluting of English morals, manners, habits, and bloodlines. The spectre of enslaved resistance was often conjured through fears about the home. Poisoning within the context of food preparation formed one strand of domestic infiltration, whilst representations of enslaved uprisings often focused on the defilement of the home. In the aftermath of the Baptist War in Jamaica in 1831 to 32, images of the ruined pastoral idyll circulated depicting unruly enslaved people at large across the Roehampton estate and bearing down menacingly on the Great House. This trope was magnified in the reporting of the Indian Mutiny in 1857, which repeatedly made reference to the sinister penetration of the sanctity of the domestic realm by colonial upstarts hell-bent on overthrowing English rule. Returning to Britain, in the midst of the dismantlement of empire in the mid-20th century, the home once again became a site in which formerly colonized people were imagined as a destabilizing and disruptive presence. In his infamous River of Blood speech of 1968, the Conservative MP Enoch Powell echoed the fears expressed by the minority planter class of the Caribbean by detailing the ways in which an uncontrolled Black population would lead to the displacement and destruction of white homes and communities. Embedded within his nightmarish vision of inverse colonization was a clarion call to defend the family, the home, and by extension, the nation, from an invading force. Fast forward to 2020, and once more English homes and families have been represented as being under attack, with the Widows' Boarding House in Wolverhampton surrendered to the demands of urban migration. The country house, the nation's symbolic home, has been threatened by the spectre of the unruly colonial past. Stately homes, as Peter Mandler has argued, occupy a particular place within the national heritage as a key site for the construction of national identity. Quote, They epitomise the English love of domesticity, of the countryside, of hierarchy, continuity, and tradition. They function as, quote, the unique embodiment of the English character. Often centred around histories of dynastic families, they have traditionally offered an understanding of history as rooted, local, and reassuringly unchanging. Just how accurate that conception of the country house is a central plank of the work spearheaded by Corinne Fowler in her Colonial Countryside project. As debates over the meaning and interpretation of the nation's heritage have raged in the press, I've returned to Stuart Hall's prescient essay, which poses the unresolved question of whose heritage. Hall recognised what was at stake in defining and representing culture. He argued that, quote, shared national identity depends on the cultural meanings which bind each other individually into the larger national story. The national heritage is a powerful source of such meanings. It follows that those who cannot see themselves reflected in its mirror cannot properly belong. The history of slavery and colonialism does not offer any easy, celebratory, or unifying version of the past, but it is the narrative which binds together much of Britain's diverse society. Slavery is not a comfortable story, and despite its historic relationship to the creed and teas on offer at the National Trust houses, it's far less palatable to consume. It does, however, offer a route to reconceptualising national history and heritage in ways which bring the marginalised histories of the colonised out from the cold and into the family home. So I want to share with you a case study which I think demonstrates how engaging with histories of slavery can profoundly enrich the ways we think about and represent the relationship between English domestic culture and empire. Durham Park is a National Trust property in Gloucestershire. Both the National Trust interim report and the website highlight the family's story of wealth accumulation generated through an active engagement in the colonial project. It's an interesting case study because although these connections are clearly the foundations of the wealth used to buy and renovate the property, they don't take the assumed form of slave and plantation ownership, but instead come through a transgenerational involvement in mercantile activity, privateering, and most notably, William Blathwaite's long career in colonial administration. In that sense, they highlight the deep embeddedness of slavery across different areas of the British economy and the British state. The house itself contains the material traces of Britain's imperial networks of trade, goods, and people. As the Trust website points out, the old staircase was made in the 1690s from imported Virginian black walnut. Colonial officials working with Blathwaite were tasked with identifying seeds and plants which could be used to ornament Durham's landscape gardens. The wilderness area was planted with trees from Virginia, peach stones, and black walnuts, and included 2 rattlesnakes for display. Perhaps the most controversial objects in the collection were 2 stands carved in the figure of enslaved Africans. These belonged to Blathwaite's uncle Thomas Povey and were previously listed in the catalogue as, quote, Blackamoor stands, end quote, until 2019 when they were recatalogued simply as stands. But there's far more to the history of Durham's colonial connections than a focus on the origins of wealth or on the material building itself or artifacts. The system of slavery was an economic one, but it had a profound human impact. One of the stories that's been highlighted in the Trust interim report and on its website is that of Mary Sarah Hibbert Oates. She was the illegitimate mixed heritage daughter of the Jamaica attorney George Hibbert Oates and a free woman of colour Margaret Cross. Over the course of around 10 years in the 1820s, her father exploited his position managing multiple plantations to father children with enslaved women. Mary had 4 siblings who were born into slavery, as well as 4 siblings that were born free. Mary was born in 1833, the year that Britain abolished slavery. Her father died 4 years later, and Mary was sent to England to live with her grandmother and aunt in Sion Hill in Bath. When her aunt died in 1870, the Reverend Winter Thomas Blathwaite acted as a trustee for her £20,000 estate. In 1876, the Reverend married Mary, and they resided in Durham Rectory. When he inherited Durham Park in 1899, Mary became Lady of the House, and we've got these amazing photographs of Mary during her time as Lady of the House at Durham Park. Durham Park then is quintessentially a dynastic Atlantic formation. These histories are not peripheral to an understanding of the family, the house, or indeed the nation's heritage. They are not a new innovation. They haven't emerged because of a political fad. They have always been there. For several decades, they've been worked into the interpretation of the house, although different levels of prominence have been afforded over time. And I'd really recommend, there's an article by Jessica Moody, which explores the different interpretive frameworks which have been used at Durham Park. And she goes through and she looks at the 2000 to 2009 General Guidebook. Then she compares it with Rupert Golding's more recent guidebook. She also looks at quite a pivotal moment within the house's history, which was when the Heritage Lottery Fund RE interpretation took place at Durham Park and used a variety of different media methods to engage local people, school children, elders in the community with these different histories. Jessica's article was published before the Colonial Countryside project launched in 2018. And before the National Trust interim report. But these are all, I think, really important indications of the ways in which we have to move away from this idea that there is the interpretation of the history. The interpretation has changed over time. Different elements have come to the fore. Notably, histories of slavery have come to the fore much more in more recent years. And I have had some indication as well that there's a future exhibition planned which will do more to publicly display these histories in Durham Park itself. So returning to Stuart Hall's question about who we choose to include in representations of the nation, what Hall calls for is a fundamental rethinking of what constitutes, quote unquote, our heritage and our sense of self. A shift to encompass the outside history that is inside the history of the English. In doing so, we can begin to understand that colonial presences were never really strangers in the house, but were instead the foundations upon which it rests.
Great, thank you, Kate. Brilliant. So now we're going to go to our final talk from Andrew Hann, who's Senior Properties Historian of Country House History at English Heritage. Andrew is a historian for houses such as Osborne House and Audley End, and he specialises in Victorian and Edwardian social history. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Kate. Well, what I'm going to do today, I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Let's just see if I can find the talk. And where's the down here? I can find. Oops. Let's see if that'll work. Right. Yeah, that looks like that's working. So what I want to do today is to say a little bit about our experiences at English Heritage at presenting the history of slavery and colonialism at some of our sites, and to focus really, because of the excellent summary that Annabelle and Charlotte have already given the basic outline of that, on some of the challenges that we've confronted, and also some of our plans for the future. So to start off, just to reiterate a little bit about the fact that this is a long story of engagement at English Heritage with this subject matter. And really our engagement goes back to, as they were saying, for 2006, 2007, when we commissioned the scoping research into slavery connections of our sites from Miranda Kaufman. And this was then followed up by some further follow-up research on 4 sites, which we looked at in more detail, and then to the conference, and of course the volume Slavery in the British Country House, which I jointly edited with Madge Dresser in 2013. I think what this shows clearly is that as an organisation, we've been engaged with discussions about slavery connections for some time, but unfortunately, because of the circumstances of the split between English Heritage and Historic England in 2015, that's not always been as obvious as it might have been. And this is partly because when the two organisations split, the waters were slightly muddied, because the diversity and inclusion unit within the old English heritage, which had funded the 2006 to 2009 research, was actually was part and which also maintained the diversity area on our website. That became part of Historic England rather than English heritage. So that meant that when we disaggregated, separated out our web content, the content relating to slavery in the country house all went on the Historic England website rather than English heritage. And really, to compound this, the focus of the new charity, of course, was on creating positioning itself as a sort of well-loved visitor attraction, and also on balancing its books. So really, the sort of diversity agenda had to take much more of a back seat in those early stages after 2015. And this is, I think, reflected a little bit in the fact that following 2007, some of the findings from that scoping research were not really widely translated into on-site and online interpretation at our sites. And this could have given the impression that slavery and colonialism had slipped down our policy agenda a little bit. But what I want to argue is actually that possibly wasn't the case, because behind the scenes there was actually a lot of work going on. We had, for instance, our Shout Out Loud youth engagement programme, which got underway in 2018. And this is aimed very much at bringing about cultural change in the organisation, involving young people and giving young people more of a voice in our activities. And the various projects that they've been involved with over the past few years have focused very heavily on contested histories, and particularly on diverse topics, including slavery and colonialism. And I'm actually working at the moment with a small group of the young producers there to actually do some sort of follow-up research based on the Kaufman report and try and pull out some more of those stories that we can generate into some web content. We also did actually deliver some new interpretation projects during that period after 2007, which Annabelle and Charlotte have already highlighted. For instance, the project at Kenwood House, which has gone through two stages of reinterpretation: the 2010 temporary exhibition, which focused very heavily on Dido Bell and the Mansfield judgment, and also the more permanent interpretation of 2013, which again has elements of it related to those topics. And also the project at Porchester Castle, this is an installation you can see here from that, which looked at the Black prisoners of war, and that opened in 2018. And we currently are involved in our major project at Marble Hill, National Lottery Heritage Fund project, which is initiated in 2015, but is due to deliver in 2022. And that's going to look very heavily at the links between Henrietta Howard and the South Sea Company through her share ownership and the payment for the construction of the house, but also at the heavy use of mahogany within the house, and that's linked to the history of enslavement. So there has been a lot actually going on. And then also behind the scenes, we've developed our research strategy, which was published in draft form in 2019. And this has two of its 5 overarching themes: untold narratives and context and connections, which both lend themselves really well to telling the story of slavery and colonialism at our sites. And certainly since 2017, there's been a presumption to consider various diverse narratives within the planning stage of all our major interpretation projects. So it's really been at the heart of our consideration since then. That said, I think certainly that as has been mentioned before, but the Black Lives Matter protests of summer of 2020 and the public focus on Black history and heritage that engendered has been very important in giving us renewed impetus for the work we've been doing. And it's really led us to reevaluate what we're doing. How inclusive has our interpretive content actually been? Were we doing enough to challenge accepted histories and to reflect the lived experiences of all our potential audiences? Now, given the restrictions of lockdown during 2020, the focus has fallen almost certainly in the early stages on our online content, and it was quickly realized that we had improvements to make in this area to make it more inclusive. And so just to go through some of the sort of quick wins we've done in this area, well, the first thing we did was to actually publish the existing slavery research, including the Kaufman report, in a new dedicated research area on our website. And this had previously only been available, of course, as I said before, on the Historic England website. We've also put together a Black History Lander, which you can see here highlighted on the slide. And that really just brings together the scattered material relating to Black history, which we already had across our website. And it sort of emphasizes that we actually did have quite a substantial corpus of material already, but now it's all brought together in one place. We also set up programs to deliver more relevant content related to Black and ethnic minority recipients of blue plaques. And we've also worked on in streamlining the process of nominations to encourage more nominations from more diverse groups rather than just the traditional groups that were being nominated. And we've also set up a landing page for our London statues, reflecting the serious amount of controversy around statues and contested heritage in the summer of 2020. And that's involving both a landing page and also a programme to deliver new web content for all of our statues. Alongside this, we've got a more longer term strategy relating to looking at our slavery and colonialism research. And this has been brought together into a more coherent programme for the first time, with the intention of delivering this strategy over the next 3 years. And this will involve, firstly, a full audit of all slavery and colonial links of all of our 420 sites. So moving on from the from the scoping research done in 2007, but also extending this work to look at gardens and collections as well, rather than just the sites themselves. And all of this comes under the umbrella of our newly launched EDI strategy, which has at its heart the desire to increase diversity and representativeness of our workforce, audiences and narratives that we tell at our sites. So I think there's an overarching structure there developing that is leading in the right direction. So what have been the challenges then? Well, as was mentioned before, the atmosphere in 2020 was certainly a challenging one for us, as it was for other heritage bodies. And we had to basically try and navigate our way through what was a very contested landscape. And so throughout, what we have been keen to do is present that what we're doing is as a long-term strategy. This isn't something we're doing as a knee-jerk response to anything that happened in 2020. And that also that it's aligned to our core principles of inspiration, conservation, involvement, and financial sustainability. So it's part of a programme of work which is actually essential to our work. And we see the need to diversify the stories we tell as central, because it's important to widen our audience appeal and to better tell the whole story of England. And there's been a very clear determination to emphasise that what we're doing is not, we have done a lot of activity in the last 18 months, but it's not a knee-jerk reaction to the current political landscape. Although we have to acknowledge that the present public mood has given more urgency and impetus to the work that we're doing. And you know, as has been said before, we have to be mindful of the response from the media and politicians, sections of the public, to the recent publication of reports by the National Trust and Historic England. I mean, in both cases, these were very measured scholarly reports, and they often pulled together what was primarily existing academic research. And yet the way they've been presented as a sort of a hit list of sites doing down Britain and so forth has been something that we would like to avoid. We're very keen to avoid being drawn into a culture war by the right-wing media. And so as a result, we've taken what I would characterize as a sort of fairly cautious approach, quietly adding new material to our website, updating our web pages to mention slavery linkages where those are relevant, ensuring that we acknowledge these sort of linkages on new interpretation panels, producing podcasts, working through our Shout Out Loud programme and our creative programme. Doing these sort of things rather than trying to bring out any high-profile media launches for events and that sort of thing. And also alongside this, we have had a part of our media strategies involved training our staff and volunteers so that they feel comfortable dealing with questions and comments from visitors around these topics. And I think that's a really important point as well, not to focus solely on the output that's going out there to the media and onto the website, but also thinking about our staff and how they might deal with any questions that come back as a response. And finally, we have to be, as was said before, mindful of the views of government. Although we're now an independent charity, the pandemic means that we're still some way away from being self-financing, and for the moment have to rely on government funding. So like other public heritage bodies, we received the letter from the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport in the autumn, setting out his vision for contested heritage. And although we might not agree with all the aspects of that, we have to be mindful of it as we move forward. So just to finish off, how would I characterize our approach? Well, I'll characterize it under 5 different headings. The first of all is that I think it has to be grounded in detailed archival research. It's really important that what we say is credible. And so we have been undertaking this research in-house with our curatorial teams, but we're also commissioning work out, and we're conducting research through collaborations with HEIs and other heritage bodies to ensure that we are coming out with material that is authoritative. Just some examples of this, we worked recently with Angus Martin doing some research in Grenada to support our Brodsworth project that we have at the moment. And we've also been working with Corinne Fowler in the University of Leicester and Culture and on an impact accelerator project to enhance some of the findings from the scoping research in 2007 to produce some new web content. And finally, we got a new PhD studentship starting in the autumn, looking at mahogany, and it's linked to enslavement and also indigenous communities in Central America. So we're ensuring that we're doing lots of collaborative working to sort of really push our research forward. Secondly, I think we're wanting to be sure that our interpretation is proportionate. So we'll highlight the connections with slavery and colonialism when these are warranted, but we won't take a one-size-fits-all approach. In some cases, it may be appropriate to have a new exhibition or a new long-form blog or article. And this is the case, for instance, at Brodsworth Hall, where we have a very strong connection between the Tellison family and all different aspects of the slave trade, ranging from the financing of plantations to sugar refining to the insurance of slave ships and cargoes and so forth. And in this case, we have a new slavery trail which is going to open in the summer. But in other cases, an acknowledgement panel will suffice, or simply a label on a portrait or an added reference on a web page. So they're making sure that what we're doing is proportionate in each case. Thirdly, I'd say in terms of we're being creative in how we respond. So we're using all the means at our disposal to get the message across. So this might be a traditional exhibition in some cases, or it might be a work of art or a multimedia platform or web content or some co-created work. And this is one example I'd like to give here, the Painting Our Past project, which we're launching in a week or so's time, which is we commissioned 6 artists from Black or mixed race background to actually paint new portraits of characters from the African diaspora linked to 6 of our sites. And those portraits are going to be displayed across those sites as a sort of a dispersed exhibition over the next 6 months. And I think really sort of demonstrates a sort of interesting and novel approach to getting this message across about the ingrained connection between the empire and colonialism and our sites. Also, finally, to finish off, also involvement. We're very keen for communities both close to our sites, but also those overseas and in the areas of the colonies to be involved in all stages of the work that we're doing. So we're involving these communities in researching, interpreting, presenting narratives of slavery and colonialism, and this includes working with descendants of the enslaved and colonized. And we're also looking, for instance, at sharing some of the research and project findings with the work that we're doing with communities in former colonies, and there's a plan to do this in Grenada for some of the findings from the research that we're currently doing at Brodsworth. And then finally, just to reiterate our measured approach to the presenting of our work, we're quietly working behind the scenes to enrich the content on our website and enhance the interpretation on sites, rather than seeking to promote new content too overtly. And this is because of really this need to show sensitivity to the often contested nature of the work that we're doing, and the fact that it is likely to elicit a whole range of responses from our audiences, both ranging from supportive to hostile. So we have to aim to inform rather than preaching to the public, and to provide a sort of balanced and appropriate response to the history of each site. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all of our speakers for such thought-provoking and insightful presentations. So if you have questions or comments, please do add them into the chat. We've heard about the ways in which in English and in British country houses and historic sites, we need to think about this kind of relationship between heritage and history. What is heritage? What is history? How are these operating in these particular sites? We've heard about the ways in which histories of slavery and histories of empire are often globally entangled histories, which are deeply embedded and sometimes difficult to make visible. How then do we make these histories visible at historic sites? Is it through material histories, through thinking about the people involved? Is it through thinking about the wealth that undergirded these forms of histories and these houses? So these are some of the questions that we perhaps want to think about and explore further in the discussion. I just wanted to start off by kind of asking a question, I guess, to the different speakers about this question of visibility and the ways in which histories can be made visible and be made visible in a sustained way in these historic sites. Do you think are there examples in which this has kind of worked well at particular properties, or do you have thoughts on kind of how that visibility might operate?
Can I start off as the heritage representative? I think there's an issue with the fact that a lot of things, particularly around 2007, were done as temporary exhibitions. So there was a big splash and people put together really interesting and thought-provoking exhibitions at various sites across the English Heritage, National Trust and elsewhere. But then those were only left in place for maybe 1 or 2 years, and then it came out and other exhibitions were put in their place. And there was this thought, we've done that subject, we can move on to something else. And I think what 2020 has reminded us is that you can't just do the subjects and then it goes away. It's actually part of the ingrained history of those sites and needs to be represented in the permanent interpretation of those sites. And I think that's something that's actually come as maybe as a bit of a surprise to some senior managers in heritage. And up until recently, this thought that actually, no, you can't just pigeonhole that and put it to one side. Then it is something that you've got to sort of continue to work with and see as part of your core offer.
If I could just follow on maybe from Andrew, I think one of the transformative potentials that we've seen in the past decade or so is the online catalogue of museums and other heritage organisations. I mean, the British Museum's online catalogue now and the V&A's are just amazing resources. If we can get the rich histories of objects written into individual catalogues, it also provides a potential for future research, whether it's undergraduate students, etc. So that if the national narrative suppresses certain angles, or history, we change in history what we're interested in any time period. That's a natural part of how history works. But if we can keep those rich, holistic catalogue entries and build on them, which it seems to me the digital allows us to have that possibility of adding to rather than always subtracting from. And of course, in any museum label, your 75 words are only going to go so far. But in the online catalogues, I think there's a real potential. And there would be even more potential if we connected them. Because, that's very often the expertise is very local rather than global. And if we could be adding in there and making those more global artifacts, I think we'd have a tremendous opportunity to keep these rich histories growing across the piece.
So I'm going to respond to both what Andrew said and also Margot as well. I think the issue of the temporary nature of some of these interventions is really problematic. As Andrew has said, I think it sort of builds an expectation that you're going to have your history foregrounded, and there's a break of trust then when a commemorative period comes to an end, or a project finishes, or the funding finishes, and that's, I think, the designation of some of this work as kind of temporary project work, I think, reinscribes a sense of what's core and what's peripheral within the institution. And one of the media responses, so it was a media statement put out by the National Trust in response to the very intense press scrutiny that it was subjected to. It highlighted that the work that the Colonial Countryside Project was doing was a temporary intervention. And I thought, you know, why have you been so quick to highlight that this is a temporary project? Because it seemed to me that in some ways that was a sort of a soothing, it was an attempt to be a kind of soothing balm of, well, you know, we've done it, we'll get it over and done with, but, you know, perhaps this won't actually translate into permanent changes to the interpretation. And I mean, I completely agree with Margot that it would be wonderful to see a lot of this stuff included in online catalogues. I think, you know, the kind of some of the work that's been done or is ongoing within museums around researching the provenance of items is really important in terms of understanding, you know, how those items came into the collection and also where they originated from. But I think we also have to be a little bit cautious about simply putting all of this material online and not having it kind of on site, because I think it creates a kind of an opt-out. And I've been to a lot of sort of, you know, I've seen this done in plantation houses, particularly in America, where, you know, you can go on the slavery tour or you can go on the furniture tour. And the two, you know, are not the same. And I mean, it was really notable. I was over in Charleston for a conference a few years ago and went on a tour to Drayton Manor, I think it's called, or Drayton Hall. And myself and my father were the only white people on the slavery tour. And, you know, kind of, it really did show the kind of racial or racialized dynamics of making things kind of optional, or suggesting that, you know, kind of there's stuff we do over here and there's stuff we do over here, and those two things aren't actually in communication with one another. So I personally, I mean, I do agree that with what Angie was saying about how, you know, it should be proportionate. And I actually think in terms of it being proportionate, it normalizes it. It says, you know, we don't have to have, you know, a brand new exhibition. We don't have to, you know, make it this thing that, you know, is sort of extraordinary about the house, but we actually imbricate those texts and those histories within the everyday kind of interpretation of the house. So, for example, the amazing work that Suzanne Seymour did in Derwent Valley Heritage Site, World Heritage Site, with training, not docents, that's the American word for it, like tour guides, yeah, thank you, on how to engage with these histories in ways that they felt comfortable and confident with, I think is a really, really good example of how you can, you know, actually sort of, you know, train up your tour guides. You can engage the general public with these histories, and you can make sure that they're present, even if you can't afford to change all the labeling or change all the interpretive panels. And of course, you know, there are costs involved in constantly changing, you know, kind of exhibitionary texts and stuff, and we are in a tight financial moment.
Great, thanks. And Charlotte and Annabelle, if you want to come in at any point, just let me know. So we've had a couple of comments about in the chat box about the kind of politicized nature of these discussions in the UK and how that's kind of taken place over the last year, 18 months, trying to kind of find maybe a way through these different responses to some of these histories and some of these interventions. How do we go about trying to have kind of proportionate interpretations? How do we go about trying to kind of find a way through these culture wars, or find a way through kind of right-wing, left-wing extremism from Aurora 2? And then sort of in response to that, Emile de Bruijn has made a comment about this trying to kind of find a bridge, and the importance of showing that, or the importance of including these global histories, these complex histories in heritage sites, and how these can actually be, showing this complexity can actually kind of add to the experience, of course, can add to people's understanding of these sites, can really enrich them, that this is a really positive step that can be made. I wonder if you have any responses to those issues of trying to kind of navigate this course and how we can show the importance of these complex histories.
I think it's very challenging. I mean, I think what Katie was saying before about trying to sort of work these narratives into your general interpretation is the way forward, because rather than highlighting it as something unusual that you're doing as a one-off or whatever, which then generates lots of tension, just making it part of the general sort of interpretation that you'd expect to find at the site, in some ways makes it more approachable and more acceptable to audiences, I think, than making it something that is startling or surprising that they come across in the form of a sort of temporary exhibition. I mean, we're having to tread a very fine line at an organisation like English Heritage now, because we are reliant on government funding for the foreseeable future for the next few years, and it's been made very clear to us in a not too guarded letter from the Secretary of State that your funding is at risk if you don't do what we feel is acceptable. It wasn't put in as many words, but that's effectively what was being said. And so we have to tread carefully, but at the same time, we don't want to dodge the subject. We want to actually to keep doing what we want to do, and to keep telling the narratives that we feel are important at our various sites. But we need to sort of do it in a way which is seen as unthreatening by, or at least it doesn't elicit the sort of response that, say, the National Trust report got. I mean, in case of the Historic England report, which also got a substantial negative response, that response came months after the report was actually published. So it's not off. It just depends on a particular journalist picking this up and then generating a storm around it, and then that leads to a whole series of other people jumping on the bandwagon. So it's just trying to avoid generating that sort of storm of negative publicity that we could potentially elicit, but carrying on doing what we're doing.
I mean, I think one thing to put this in perspective that we need to remember, these histories, when they were happening in the 18th and the 19th century, were incredibly contested. You know, people were angry about the East India Company. You know, it was not as though everyone in the 18th and 19th century thought, oh, the East India Company, what a fantastic idea. It's notorious for its corruption, its ineptitude, its militarism, and again, slavery. It's not as though everybody thought, oh, what a fantastic institution. These were hotly contested political issues in the past. So we can't claim them as neutral territory in that way. We completely dehistoricize them if we take them out of political contestation. So I think a part of what we need to do is to say, to accurately discuss the past, we have got to deal with the contested nature of these contested heritages. So I think that's a part of it. I think the other thing that we're beginning to see is quite different levels of engagement because of the Dowden policy. England is significantly behind Scotland and Wales in taking this forward at national level. Scotland has a very different attitude to this than England does, and because of devolved government, it's allowed to. But you're also seeing, and you see this particularly at the moment with the Benin bronzes and the return, you're seeing heritage organizations that hold Benin bronzes that are not controlled by the Culture Secretary that are giving them back. You know, so you've got a different periodicity between the arm's length organizations, where that arm's length is shrinking, and where there's a very slow pace of change, and other organizations and other British nations, you've got a very different pace of change. So I think we're going to see a very uneven landscape in the next 5 to 10 years.
So I was just going to respond to the points that were being made about the notion that we should, I guess, potentially try and remove the politics from these issues. I mean, I agree with Margot, they are deeply, deeply political issues historically, but I also think that we have to acknowledge the politics of the history of museums as well, not just the history of the subjects that they're representing, that museums and cultural institutions are political bodies, and they always have been. They sometimes are a function of the state in terms of, kind of the ways in which they are funded, and to a degree although of course there is a separation, although a worrying incursion on that separation has been some of the actions that have occurred recently in terms of Oliver Dowden's use of the issue of funding and kind of attempting to influence the ways in which cultural institutions represent these histories. But I think there also needs to be an acknowledgement that the idea that that museums or heritage institutions are apolitical, or that the status quo is apolitical, is actually a misnomer as well. The status quo has politics embedded in it. It's just that they have been presented as neutral, and it's something that I think in terms of this idea of both the historian and also the museum as being some kind of objective, neutral observer of the past, it is a sort of fallacy. We are subjective, and museums have in thinking about the representation of history and heritage, that
I think we're losing you a little bit, Katie. Oh, you're back. We might go on to the next question, if that's all right, Kate, and then we'll come back to you when you were in a different Wi-Fi spot. There you go.
Yeah.
Great. So we have a few more questions coming in. One which kind of speaks to obviously some of the issues that we heard about in Lewis's session on the US, and this is something that Andrew mentioned. How are heritage organisations thinking about working with people from former colonized countries? How are they actually developing these kinds of links, and where is that going? Andrew, I think, do you want to respond to that, and then we'll go maybe to Kate Telch's question?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's something that's very pertinent to us at the moment, because we're working on, as I said in my talk, on this project at Broadsworth Hall at the moment, where we've been working. There's very close links between the Tellisons who live there and Grenada, and we realised very early on that we needed to make contact with some researchers and people in Grenada to get a different side of the story, rather than just going through the archival material in the UK. And the conversations they had with us very much, when we got onto discussions of, what are you going to give back to us in return for this research that we're sharing with you, and it made us really think seriously about, yes, what are we going to give back? How it's not just enough just to pay some money for a piece of research, commission a piece of research out. We have a responsibility to give back in terms of sharing the content that we're generating, sharing our research with the communities back in the Caribbean. And so that's what we're going to do. We're hoping to set up a seminar series with the museum there to actually share some of this research, and maybe also look into helping setting up a volunteer project to scan and some of the documents relevant to study of researchers out in Grenada, so that they can actually access some of that material which is currently in the National Archives here and is inaccessible to them, so that we can actually have a proper reciprocal relationship, rather than a sort of simply. Otherwise, if we don't do that, we're effectively just repeating the sort of process of colonization by just taking from them rather than actually giving much back.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Corinne and Amy point out, these are histories that actually visitors are interested in. They want to be kind of hearing these complex histories. We want to be working with different organizations to bring those out and to see those links. Absolutely. Kate Telch has got a question for Margot on Henry Thomas Colebrook, but also kind of broader question that you can see in the chat, Margot, about the connections between material history and heritage and the writing of colonial histories and knowledge of the colonies, the importance perhaps of material history and trying to kind of write those histories.
Yeah, so H.T. Colebrook is the brother of the Colebrook who was in Delhi as a resident. And H.T. Colebrook is a very well-known Orientalist whose own purchases of not country houses, but property at the Cape and property in the US, again remind us the ways in which these multiple colonial investments in wealth spread out in interesting ways. Again, his wealth is partly enabled by his mother's Antiguan plantations. So we've just got these taproots and these seeds going in multiple directions, not just between India and the Caribbean. I think the issue about the ability of material histories to augment, to amplify, to discomfort our traditional narratives is a really important one. And I think that's really what several decades now of material culture history have allowed us to do. And some of the more interesting work too, I think we're seeing the ways in which not only indigenous elites in colonized places, but the ways in which the material cultures of just normal working class people in colonized places then also become sources that we can speak with. And I think, I've not yet read it, I've only read reviews of it, so I may have gotten this wrong, but I think Glenn Adamson's new book, An American Craft, does in part look at the proportion of American craft that is crafted with enslaved hands, for example. And so registering the production of material objects. And I think this is what English Heritage's mahogany PhD studentship presumably is in part going to do, is going to look at wider ways of thinking of material culture that go from the actual material that material culture is crafted from and thinking about those wider histories.
Great, thank you. And we're sort of running low on time already. So we have one maybe final question even from Caroline Stanford about, the ways in which people of colour are being consulted about heritage presentation, how different groups are actually being involved in these changing heritage presentations, and the question of the underrepresentation of people of colour in the British heritage sector. And also, of course, do these research topics reflect just current interests, or are they kind of emerging from other concerns? Who wants to come in first on those questions?
No, I could do just a quick one in terms of National Museum Scotland, which is has a 4-part program for rethinking their discovery galleries, which are sort of the core galleries when you go in. And certainly they have done a very good job of getting community engagement, including from Black local experts, into that mix from the outset, rather than relying only on academics who are predominantly white or only upon curatorial staff who are predominantly white. There's a larger piece of work at the Royal Historical Society, the Social History Society, and other history societies in the UK have been working on to try and work on the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic pipeline into postgraduate study. And I think that's a real pinch point that we have to work on much more fundamentally.
I was going to say, I just wanted to flag up the work of Museum Detox, because I think they are an absolutely brilliant group of museum professionals, heritage professionals who are really, I think, making a big impact in terms of the things that they are pushing for. So if anyone doesn't know them, they are a Black, Asian, minority ethnic museum professionals and heritage group. And they've done some absolutely outstanding curatorial work, and I think are really pressing on issues of representation, recruitment and retention within the heritage sector. And I think it's really important, because a lot of the work in 2007 that was done around things like community consultation or community advisory groups, that's not the same as having permanent members of staff who are actually embedded within the organisation. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the things that I have noticed with, a number of kind of the sort of project work that has come out, even with in a National Museum Scotland who appointed a curator of slavery and empire, but it's a temporary post. I mean, it's quite a long temporary post, but it's still a temporary post. And I think one of the things for me that would be incredibly positive in terms of as a sort of, you know, a gesture from the sector that this isn't a peripheral history, that this is core, would be if some of these curatorial positions were made permanent, because it really sends the message that, you know, this history is history that's here to stay, and we're willing to invest institutionally in people to develop that knowledge within our institution, and then have the kind of the security that comes with longevity within an institution to change the culture from within.
I just had to agree with everything that Katie's just said then. I mean, I think within English Heritage, we really are trying to do that now. We've just launched our EDI strategy, which one of the basic strands of that is to diversify our workforce. And we are actively looking to recruit more curatorial staff from Black Asian and ethnic minority backgrounds, and also from all different diverse backgrounds. And, you know, in projects that I'm currently working on, we've been involving a number of different researchers and consultants advising us who are Black researchers. We've got with the youth engagement program, Shout Out Loud has got a very diverse cohort of young people who are working on that and who are actually feeding their ideas into the general sort of policy makeup of the organisation in terms of very much focusing more on the youth agenda. And we've been working with lots of Black artists and creatives in our creative program. So there's all sorts of ways that we're actually trying to address this issue at the moment. And you know, it's one of these, there's still more we can do, but there's a lot, and I don't think that we're alone. I'm sure that the National Trust and other heritage bodies are doing the same thing, and the examples that Katie and Margot have just given.
Great. Joy, can I just check that, do you want, I can see your hand raised, but you also popped the notes in the chat. Do the notes in the chat cover it, or do you have a question?
No, I just wanted to make that point about from Indigenous protocols in Canada and North America. In many ways, I think are quite ahead of us, and it's worth looking at the protocols that have been produced and comparing them, because they have a whole set of not rules, but good practice. And the key takeaway is nothing about me without me, which is very uncomfortable actually in terms of conventional research, because it's very serious, and it means that you literally can't do anything that involves slavery or Indigenous folk on any level that doesn't involve not just Indigenous academics, but elders. And that really, you know, puts a little bomb inside the whole research process. And if we were to go down that path, I think it would be quite uncomfortable and deliberately intending to be massively uncomfortable. And the second point I just wanted to make is RL UK have been in touch with me anyway, and probably the rest of the people here, talking about a new tranche of funding that I think we should all be looking out for and maybe ganging together to access. And that will allow, I hope, or I've asked for curators to be brought over from Indigenous communities or ex-slave communities or all over the world to change the archives and not just the synthesis and expression of research. I just wanted to make that point.
Great, thanks ever so much, Joy. And we are still working on this knowledge hub, which will kind of act as a website for the seminar. So if you get those details, Joy, could you send them through to us and we can put them on the knowledge hub when that becomes available, hopefully in the next month or so. So unfortunately, we've run out of time, and just to say a huge thank you really to all our speakers for their presentations and for their responses to the questions. I think this is a conversation, of course, that's been so alive in the UK for the last year, 18 months, for the last 20 years in some ways, and will continue to be so. So it's great to kind of have your input and learn your thoughts and reflections at this particular moment. No doubt things will change and continue to change, and hopefully the seminar will be part of that conversation.